Okay, we're double live.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to our July live stream. We're actually going to end up doing two live streams in July just because of the way that it works, because we do it every 4 weeks. But one of the things that's interesting is we've been operating under financial quarters. So every 3 months we do like a reflection period. And I've also been sharing some information in the live stream that's nearest to that quarter benchmark. So today we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the progress over the past 3 months, and then just briefly, and then explaining what we're working on, and then also a new opportunity that's popped up that seems really enticing and really exciting. So I'd like to share that as well. So I'll start with my usual presentation, and then we'll move on to questions. So let me share my screen. Can you see that?
Yep, you're good.
Cool. Great. Cool. So one of the things that we track is our community and the community growth. So over the past 3 months, we have seen 67% growth. So we went from 7,300 members up to over 1,200 members, or sorry, 12,000 members rather. So pretty significant. We also launched 3 new servers. So these are the first 3 servers since December. So so far, Portuguese is doing pretty well. Italian's kind of quiet, but Arabic is also very active. The mods in the Arabic server have just been very engaged and are trying to, build some sense of community there. And they've started their own book club and everything else. So it's been pretty exciting to watch that. As per usual, the Japanese server just dwarfs all the rest of them, but it's starting to shrink. The gap is starting to shrink. So when we first started, the Japanese server was about 70% the size of Refold Central, and now it's getting close down to 60. So it's cool to see the other servers growing and the Japanese server no longer being quite as dominant, but obviously still a lot of work to do to bring up the activity levels in the other servers. Over the past 3 weeks, because we screwed up the schedule a little bit for the last live stream, so it's only been 3 weeks rather than 4. On the publicity side, Matt published a persistent puzzles video, which is awesome. I had a really good time watching that. And we've gotten a lot of really good feedback on it. It's a piece of information that I feel like the community was really needing. And it sounds like it's resonated with a lot of folks. So thanks, Matt, for all the hard work that you put into that. It was definitely a creative video, so it was cool to see.
Thank you.
And then also releasing the interview with Nick the comedian. And
He's
on
actually a
the
singer, but
project,
it's all good.
oh, sorry, I thought, oh, that's a different, you're right, there's a different Nick names. There's a different comedian named Nick, right?
Yeah. There's another
Yeah,
guy who learned Japanese, who's a comedian, and there's another video with him coming eventually. So
got it. I mixed them up. Sorry about that.
no worries.
Cool. On the project side, the JP1K V2 deck is in progress. We have almost completed loading sentences into it for all 1,000 words. So the next step with that will be to review those sentences and start recording audio. Same with the ES1K deck. That's a little bit behind. We're 100, 200 sentences into that. Both of those are manual, so we're having a human eyes go through and make sure that they're really high quality. So that's why it's taking quite a while. On the website V2 project, we have started redesigning the user interface to make it more friendly for the new features that are coming. And then we also have a bunch of new merch that is currently on the store, but is not quite, it's not outlined the way that I would like. It's not designed the way that I would like, so I haven't announced it yet. But we've got mugs, we got to-go mugs, we've got another color shirts, and a couple other things. Oh, stickers, right. So that is what we've been working on. Looking forward into July, we're basically going to continue everything that we've been working on the past 3 weeks. So finishing the 2 decks and then incorporating the quick start guides and then launching those on the website. So all the website changes necessary to do that. And so the cool new opportunity that popped up, I have a friend in Israel. He lives in an Arab village in northern Israel on the border of Lebanon. And he approached me about organizing a summer school or a summer program to teach English to the kids there who speak Arabic fluently and learn Hebrew in school, but their English, they also learn English in school, but it's not great. And so this is essentially going to be our first attempt at trying to adapt the ideas of Refold into something that'll work in a classroom setting. So pretty excited to see what becomes of that, sort of as a testing ground for what we would like to do in the future. So this is sort of a less official, like just a fun thing on their end that they want to organize, and gives us an opportunity to test out some of our ideas. So we're going to be organizing a sort of an immersion plan for the students. So it'll be YouTube and TV shows, and then we'll come up with frequency lists that sort of explain which words they should be learning in what order, and then how we can teach those most effectively to the students. So pretty excited for that in the upcoming weeks. I think that is all I got for today. So if you have any questions about what I just shared, feel free to put them in the chat. And otherwise, we'll just start going through the questions that are there. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. Really appreciate it. Gives us a nice jumping off point. So the first question up is from Fukai Mori. What do you think primarily keeps perennial beginners stuck in the beginner stage? Poor study techniques, or are their brains not wired to readily decode foreign input beyond low-hanging fruit?
I think the vast majority of perennial beginners are perennial beginners because they don't actually spend time doing language learning activities. I think they spend a lot of time. I mean, I think there's so many different things that can happen. There's people who they might have little like 1 to 2 months bursts of time where they're really motivated to study and they spend a lot of time studying, and then they kind of lose interest, and then maybe they spend like 3 to 6 months playing video games or doing other hobbies and not touching language learning at all. So they're really only language learning, 1 to 2 months, or maybe between like 1 and 4 months out of the year. And so, of course, that's going to keep you in a loop of not really doing anything. Maybe there's other people who they're perennial language learners and they're always interested in language learning, but maybe they just don't really set aside time to sit and do actual language learning activities. Instead, they're mostly talking about language learning, watching content about language learning. I think there's probably a good number of people who are like that. There's also people who just jump around between a bunch of different languages, and so they never spend enough time on one specific language to get good. And maybe there's some people who are consistently spending time trying to learn a specific language, but because they're doing all the wrong activities, they're just not really making solid progress. Like if there's people who are doing nothing but studying with a textbook and memorizing things out of a textbook, but they never spend any time actually getting input, and they don't actually spend any time immersing themselves in their target language, then they're not really going to make a lot of progress. So there's factors like that. I don't think there's hardly anybody who is actually regularly, consistently spending significant amounts of time immersing themselves in their target language and are stuck as a perennial beginner. I've never honestly met anyone like that.
Yeah, one thing I'll add, when I spoke at the ChatterConf conference, or Chatterbug conference, someone made the observation that the tools out there for language learning are either very focused on beginners or they're focused on advanced. So you have like Babbel, Duolingo that are teaching this like basic stuff in the language, and then there's this like big gap until you hit like italki, where you're actually like talking to natives. And so I think for most language learners who haven't yet come across immersion, their study plan is essentially do all the beginner stuff and then try and jump to the advanced stuff and start outputting. And that's just really painful. And so I think people get sort of caught because they can't make that jump. And one of the things that like we are trying to do is essentially bridge that gap, say it's okay to use some beginner stuff, but the goal is to like get and actually spend time with the language, and then spend time with the language until you can actually start talking to natives. So I think for a lot of beginners out there who just aren't familiar with immersion methods, they just don't know it exists, and they don't know that there's this big gap that they need to fill before they can reasonably jump to the next level. So they just stay in that beginner phase forever. Yeah, those are my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Especially with the apps. Like I mentioned textbooks, but actually, yeah, now that you point that out, Ethan, probably the majority of people who are perennial beginners are just doing apps, which only are able to teach you the basics. And so then they don't really know where to go from there. So like you said, they kind of just end up doing that same stuff in the kiddie pond perpetually.
Yeah, and one of the things that we advise in the guide is to just jump into immersion immediately. And we have this metaphor about learning to swim, where you can't learn to swim until you jump in the pool. But a lot of those other methods, and then teachers are like, well, we can't expose students to language they won't understand because they won't be able to enjoy it, they won't be able to engage with it, and so they hold students back and say like, no, we're going to like keep you in this little bubble, and then we'll expose you to something once we feel you're ready for it. And our perspective on that is reversed. It's like you'll never be ready for it, so you might as well just jump in from day one.
Yeah, I almost think there's kind of an analogy to exercise where a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to watch something I can't understand because that won't be fun. It won't be comfortable. So they'll be like, okay, it's okay. You don't have to do something that makes you uncomfortable. But if you're talking about exercise, if someone was like, oh, I don't want to exercise because it makes me uncomfortable, then the thing that someone who's trying to help you improve your health would say is not, okay, then you don't have to exercise. It would be, okay, well, let's try to find a way to make the uncomfort of exercising masked with fun because you're actually like playing a sport that you enjoy, or you're listening to music while you do it, or there's so many ways to make the act of exercising fun, even though ultimately probably you're still feeling that same uncomfort or discomfort, but it's just not bothering you because it's in the context of something that you're engaged in. So I think we're trying to replicate a similar thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of corollaries between language learning and physical fitness that we've talked about before. So cool. Thanks for the question. Moving on. Iapetus. I've almost finished my first true novel in Japanese. Congratulations. I found a lot of the content understandable after spending 2 weeks mining a lot of words that appear frequently in novels. However, there are occasionally very long sentences that I need to isolate and break down to understand, despite knowing all the words in the sentence. My question is it a very bad habit to regularly translate these sentences after breaking them down in order to check my understanding?
I don't think that habit is going to, cause any significant damage, but it's not probably something I would encourage. It's just because during the amount of time that you spend breaking down and translating that sentence, you could probably read like 10 to 50 other sentences. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe you could read around like 20 other sentences. And within those 20 sentences, there might be 5 that were I+1. And those 5 I+1 sentences are going to grow your raw ability in the language much more than all the time you spent analytically breaking down that long sentence that was too far above your level for you to be able to get it right away or get it after just a few moments. So yeah, I don't think it's going to do you a ton of harm, but it's just not the wisest use of time when you consider all the different factors.
Yeah, and I think there might be a clarification here. I interpreted this question as, is it bad to like use Google Translate to translate the sentence after breaking it down in order to check whether you broke it down and understood it correctly? And I feel like this is a question that comes up often in the community, and there's a lot of different perspectives and opinions about it. Some people really appreciate the automatic translations because it allows them to check their understanding and make sure that they are actually comprehending something at the level that they're comprehending. But then there's another camp of people who feel that if you have those translations readily available, you don't actually give your brain the opportunity to struggle with it. And your brain struggling with it is what it allows you to actually learn from it.
In response to that, I would say it probably depends on what your target language is. I think this person said they're learning Japanese, in which case this isn't actually one of the problems you mentioned, but Japanese is just so different from English that even an accurate English translation has a lot of potential to give you a warped interpretation of what the word means or kind of misguide you when it comes to trying to understand what a sentence means. And so because the languages are just fundamentally different, translation itself is just almost never a good tool or method for deepening your understanding of the target language. So I would not recommend really ever relying on Google Translate or some kind of translation to help you deepen your understanding of a language that's like just totally different than your native language. But if you're learning two languages that are really similar and they used to be the same language at some point in history, then I can see that it probably would be helpful in certain contexts to rely on the automatic translation or whatever. Just the thing is, you don't want to be doing it too much. You don't want to be every single sentence you're checking the English, because then you're never really going to give your brain an opportunity to develop its own intuition for the language. But as long as you manage to only use that in moderation, then for similar languages, I could see that being totally fine.
Great. Thanks for the question. Teehee Tummy Tums, great name. Any tips on going directly from TL to mentalese instead of TL to NL to mentalese? I find it easier for nouns like the color blue or basketball or something, but a lot harder for more abstract words / concepts that can't really be experienced. Any tips for just being more comfortable with mentalese in general?
I mean, one thing that I used to do, especially when I was reviewing cards, like sentence cards and Anki, and I wanted to make sure that I was understanding the sentence without having to translate it into English, I would just try to imagine a scene in my mind's eye where it would make sense to say that sentence. Not necessarily the only context or the only scene where it would make sense to say that sentence, but just a scene. And I found that gave my mind something to do and allowed me to confirm that I was truly understanding what I was reading without having to translate it into English. So I think, just trying to get creative when it comes to using your mind's eye to kind of visualize something related to the sentence can be a good way to move into that a little more. And it's mostly just over time. Like, if you get more and more immersion, you'll naturally drop the translations more and more. You'll naturally just be working in mentalese more and more. It happens automatically, so you don't have to be trying to consciously make this happen, but I do think that doing what I just said as an exercise can help push yourself in that direction.
I actually went through this exact experience in probably September of last year, where I found that my brain was just constantly trying to translate everything into English, and it was actually distracting me from my immersion, because I would hear a word and then I'd be like, oh, what is that again? And then I'd lose the train of whatever they were saying. And I still experience that sometimes, but I find that one of the ways that helps me stay focused is actually mental shadowing. So just trying to make sure that I hear every word and sort of like repeat the word back to myself in real time, because it takes up so much mental energy that it stops my brain from trying to translate. So personally, that has helped me, but I can't make any broader recommendations around that. All right, thanks for the question. Next up, Nofi is asking, if someone wanted to become fluent by pure listening, or almost pure, with little to no Anki, how could one possibly go about this, especially for a language far removed from their NL? Is it possible? Could this be done in a reasonable time frame?
This person said with no Anki. They specified that?
Little or no Anki.
I mean, there's a lot of things you could do. First of all, for example, there's this school in Thailand where it's to teach foreigners Thai, and it's taught entirely through comprehensible input. So the teachers just, right from day one, they speak to the students 100% in Thai, and then the students can speak back in English if they're English speakers. And so they're not forced to output, and they can speak back, but all they're getting is comprehensible input. And they're not taught grammar or vocabulary or anything. And apparently people go on to reach pretty solid levels of fluency really quickly in this system. So if you can get high enough quality comprehensible input, that alone, that's all you need, right? That's kind of what the input hypothesis says. So you could probably replicate this just by watching tons of TV shows, but unless you have extremely high tolerance for ambiguity / tolerance for really boring kids shows that are super comprehensible, then that would probably be really challenging. And so then the question becomes, what are you going to do beyond just sitting and watching comprehensible input to try to speed up the process or make it a little bit more enjoyable? And I think you could definitely look up words, even without learning the writing system. You could as long as you have some way to transcribe words, whether that's through the International Phonetic Alphabet or through romanization, or maybe you just learned the basics of the script of your target language just so that you can spell out words that you hear, then you could probably look up words as you pick them out auditorily, right? And then if you're able to hear it clearly enough, or you could type it into some kind of dictionary and get the meaning, then you could pick up words that way, and then reinforce them just through coming across them over and over in your immersion. So I definitely think it's possible to get good this way. I know some people who have basically learned a language this way, so it's definitely possible. I think it's going to work better for some people than others. Some people are just kind of inherently more audio learners. Like I know that the idea of there being like visual learners and audio learners has kind of been debunked. We all learn through all mediums or all senses, but there's some people who just seem to naturally resonate with that type of approach versus a more reading heavy approach, and some people seem to resonate with the more reading heavy approach. So it probably depends on your personality and where you naturally gravitate to, but it's definitely possible. And if you're someone who kind of really resonates with this approach and you can really enjoy it and get into it and spend a ton of time on it, then you could probably get good relatively quickly. I mean, I always think that using Anki is going to help you progress faster than not using Anki, and I also think that using Anki is separate from whether you're taking a reading approach or a listening approach. There are ways to use Anki even while taking a pretty much all listening approach. But if you wanted to limit yourself and to not use Anki, then yeah, I don't think you're going to be improving as fast as somebody who's reading and using Anki, but I still think you could probably make decent progress. But yeah, I don't have a big enough sample size of case studies to really be able to have like concrete time frames.
Yeah, Krashen's famous lecture that he did where he spoke in German to an audience and like drew pictures to make it comprehensible was sort of an example of learning through pure listening, well, and visual medium as well. And I know that at least in Spanish, there's Dreaming Spanish, and they create those types of videos, and they have thousands of videos at this point trying to teach that way. So yeah, if you can find content for your target language that teaches that way, in the same way the Thai school does, then it maybe isn't as hard as it otherwise would be. Cool, thanks for the question. Cameron is asking, does extended input with TL subs harm pure listening ability? After I watch large quantities of content with TL subs, I feel like when I go back to pure listening that I am less capable of comprehending a show that was previously comprehensible. Is this an illusion, or should I spend more time doing pure listening to keep it in line with my reading ability?
I mean, I would say that what you're experiencing right there is probably mostly an illusion. Sorry, I feel like I have to sneeze, but not really. But yeah, it's probably just that the contrast, right? I think there are a lot of psychological studies showing that contrast has a really big influence on human perception. So, for example, if you have 3 buckets of water, the one on the left is cold water, the one in the center is lukewarm room temperature, and the one on the right is hot water, and you put both hands in both cups of water, and in the two sides, the one in the hot, one in the cold, for a couple minutes, and then you put both hands in the neutral lukewarm room temperature bucket of water. The water feels like it's a different temperature on each hand. Like the one that was in the hot water, it's going to feel cold. The one that was in the cold water, it's going to feel hot. And there's a lot of different versions of a similar experiment that basically just show that when you experience 2 very different things, one after the other, the second one, the difference is exaggerated to your subjective perception. So if you spend a lot of, like, let's say you watch a show, you're just pure listening, you understand a certain amount, it's fine. Then you go watch the target language subs, and you understand way more, and you get used to understanding way more. Then when you suddenly drop the subs, the difference in your comprehension is going to feel exaggerated to you subjectively. So that's why it's going to feel, oh, what? I got even worse. I was worse than when I started. In reality, you're probably not worse. You might even be a little better, but you feel worse because that contrast is biasing your perception. So short term, I don't think that there's any real way that it directly harms you in the way that it kind of seems like you're feeling like you were experiencing. But in the long term, if you constantly watch with subs and you never watch raw, I mean, that's basically kind of similar to, like, what if you only did reading and you never did listening? There are some potential kind of theoretical negative side effects that I feel like I've experienced by when I was learning Japanese, I was pretty reading dominant, where basically, if you watch my video on my main channel called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language, I explain in a lot of detail how the process of comprehending spoken language is both a top-down process and a bottom-up process, which happens simultaneously. And I'm not going to go into exactly how it works because I have a whole like 30-minute long video on that. But basically what this shows is that listening ability is not just a matter of hearing the sounds. It's also a matter of kind of deducing what is likely to be said given the context and given your knowledge of the language. And if you're learning just through listening, then your ability to hear the sounds and parse the sounds and your ability to deduce what's likely being said from context kind of develop in tandem. But if you learn the language largely through reading or largely through subtitles, which is kind of more like reading than listening, then what can happen is that your bottom-up ability to kind of, your top-down ability to predict what's likely being said based on the context and based on your knowledge of the language gets far more developed than your just raw ability to parse the sounds. And so you end up kind of being out of balance, and it can be really hard to correct this balance once your brain adjusts to always kind of over-relying on the top-down process over the bottom-up process. So if you learn the language too much through reading and not enough through listening, then I do think that can have like long-term negative effects that will show up in the form of mostly probably not having as good pronunciation, but also potentially through not having quite as strong listening ability as you could, especially when you're listening to accents you're not used to or mumbling and things like that. So there are some potential side effects, but as long as you're doing passive listening in addition to your active immersion, and your active immersion is balanced between reading and listening, balanced between reading activities like reading books or watching with subs and pure listening with no subs, then I think you should be pretty fine. And that's how we designed the Refold roadmap, so that you would end up pretty balanced overall.
Great. Thanks for the question, Cameron. And if you have questions, please throw them into the chat. We've got 3 more left, but we'll definitely have time for more. So, Nofi is asking, sometimes when I do free flow immersion and I'm really invested in the movie/show, I find my brain not really hearing the Japanese anymore, but rather just understanding or not understanding. I guess mentalese is the best term here. Is this just the brain filling in the gaps with just visual cues, or is there something deeper happening with the brain? I flirted with Japanese for around 11 years, or since I was around 11 years old, mostly with NL subs, but sometimes not. Is this just placebo, or am I in an acquisition mode? I'd say I'm probably around early stage 2. Is this normal for beginners?
I mean, I don't really know. It's hard to say because I can't like look into your head and know exactly what you're experiencing. But in general, Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis kind of points in the direction that acquisition is an unconscious process. And it happens when you're very engaged in receiving a message, whether that's understanding a story or understanding a person, or when you're trying to communicate yourself, you're having an exchange. And so if you feel like you're kind of consciously, you're just focused on the meaning, and you're letting your unconscious take care of the specific analytical things of the grammar and the vocab, that's probably a good thing. And that probably means that you're in a flow state, and your whole brain is kind of collaborating cohesively to help you understand as much as possible and acquire the language. So based on all the stuff that I've seen and experienced, it kind of seems like, yeah, when you get into that flow state mode where you're mostly just focused on the meaning, that is probably the ideal state that you can be in. And that's the goal, especially for free flow immersion. I think there also are benefits to breaking down language more analytically, but ultimately, yeah, to integrate everything you learn when you're breaking down analytically, you have to eventually go into a mode where you're letting your unconscious do all the work and let that automaticity build up. Because if you want to do anything real in the language, you need to be able to use the language automatically and have that effortlessness there. So.
Great. Thanks for the question. Will is asking, I'm pretty faithful with my Anki, but it still kicks my butt. I can get the meaning most of the time, but getting the reading is what kills me. Any advice here? Is this maybe due to the fact that I normally watch without subtitles? I cannot find TL subs for the show that I watch. My target language is Japanese. This is bothering me a bit as it affects my inner voice when reading manga. I'll be reading along and voice the kanji in English, which is problematic, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say probably the biggest thing you can do to improve your ability to recall kanji readings is to read more. So reading more manga, reading more blog posts or comments, or even of course reading books as well. Even watching with target language subtitles as well are really good things to train your kanji recognition and get it to the point where it feels really automatic and natural. So yeah, I mean the thing is, Anki isn't designed to help you train automaticity. See, there's kind of a subtle difference between your ability to recall something versus how easy it is for you to recall something. There might be some things that you can recall very consistently, and maybe the memory is strong in the specific aspect where even if you didn't review it for multiple years, when quizzed on it you could recall it, yet it's very difficult for you to recall. It takes a lot of effort and it's not automatic, and this can happen, right? There can actually be memories where you're not going to forget this thing for years, yet even right now if someone quizzes you on it, it's very difficult and effortful for you to recall it. So the effort or the automaticity with which you're able to recall something is actually somewhat independent from just whether or not you can recall it, yes or no, and how strong the memory is in terms of how long will it last, how long will you remain able to recall it. And spaced repetition algorithms are only optimizing for that second one, just whether you're able to recall it, yes or no. And so if you just grade your cards accurately, you will, for the most part, have a pretty high retention rate in the sense of you'll be able to recall them, but it might not be automatic. And that's just because that's not what the SRS was designed for. So this does leave you sometimes with this problem of it's like, well, yeah, I know this stuff, but it's not that helpful because when I'm actually reading it, the knowledge isn't there. I have to like sit and contemplate it, and that's not what I need. I need that automatic, really effortless recall. So, I mean, I would attack this problem from two different sides. The most direct solution is just read more, right? Reading more will take the base knowledge that you built in Anki and turn it into something that's automatic. And ultimately, there's no real replacement for just getting lots of immersion. That's what immersion is for, right? You have to turn this knowledge into acquired ability through recalling it over and over and over again in different contexts and things like this. The other thing is you can improve this problem by just failing cards in Anki more readily, right? If you just bias yourself to failing cards more often, well then on average or basically a better way to put this might be, we all have a kind of internal threshold when we're grading our cards where we say, okay, if my knowledge of this word is above this threshold, or if my ability to recall the meaning of the reading is above this threshold, I grade it good. If it's below this threshold, then I grade it bad, or I grade it again. And so if you lower this threshold, that means that you're going to be failing cards more readily, and that's going to lead to you having the cards come up more, and when they come up more, then they're going to be fresher in your memory. So if you, in a way, make your standards more strict with an Anki, it might seem like, oh no, well if I make my standards strict, I fail more cards, then that's going to make me have more reps, and then Anki's going to get even harder to do. And that can happen, but what can also happen is if you just kind of approach the whole thing in a kind of playful, lighthearted way, if you're just very quick to fail cards, then that means that basically you're going to end up knowing all your cards better. And because as soon, for example, like let's say one way to think about it is when a plant is growing, you know how you prune the dead leaves, because the dead leaves are kind of like holding back the plant from growing more efficiently and more healthily. And so by pruning the things that are unhealthy, the thing ends up becoming healthier as a whole. And so in a similar way, when you fail cards, as soon as they start to not feel so clear, so you fail them more quickly than you would otherwise, in a way you're kind of pruning the bad card, and then you're relearning it and turning it into something that's healthy and putting it back into the system. So by failing bad cards more quickly, you're keeping your whole system healthier. And when your whole system is healthier, which in this case means you know all your cards better and you can recall them more easily, then all your Anki reps become easier and more quick and more enjoyable because it doesn't take so much effort. So there's actually some benefits to failing cards more readily than you might otherwise, and that can improve that whole problem.
So I think you might want to I want to clarify something. I think that Will is asking Specifically, he's having issues recalling reading during immersion. When he's reading manga, he can't remember the reading of the kanji that he's coming across, so his internal voice is pronouncing it wrong. But that meaning he's getting relatively easily.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I don't think that really changes anything that I said. I mean, like I said, to get really good at recalling the kanji readings, you have to read a lot. And so, I mean, yeah, if you can't recall the kanji reading while you're reading, I would, in general, if it's a word that you know and you feel like, oh, I know this word, I should know the reading, I would stop and look it up. And that's what I always did. It can be a pain, but it's like you have to recall kanji readings over and over again for them to become automatic. And if you just see the kanji and you don't recall the reading and you move on, then that you didn't actually improve at recalling the kanji reading in any way. So at some point you have to actually just, if you don't know it, you have to look it up. And so try to recall it, even if it feels like it's taxing your memory. You got to try to recall it. Sorry, I was just reading Will's comment. Yeah, you got to try to recall it. And a lot of times you'll be able to recall it. It'll just take a little more effort, right? But that's only the first time. If you can see it, be like, oh, I should know this. What is it? Oh, yeah, it's this. Then next time you come across it, you're probably going to be able to recall it more easily. So you kind of, in that way, you by doing that mental rep, you strengthen the memory. And if even after trying to recall it, you can't remember it, then look it up. And then the act of looking it up after trying to recall it, that will also strengthen your memory, because then you'll have that, oh yeah, I remember now, crap, I should have known that feeling, and that will also strengthen the memory. So yeah, while you're doing, and again, you don't have to look up the kanji readings for everything, but for the things that you think you should know, then yeah, I would look those up, and then yeah, just reading more in general as well will help you build up your kanji reading. And everything that I said about Anki also applies, just specifically in the case of kanji readings, right? If you feel a little iffy on a reading, fail the card more quickly. Because if you feel a little iffy on a reading in Anki, well, you're also going to feel iffy on it when you come across it in the wild, right? So,
well, I think this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but I think this probably relates to the JP1K deck, where the instructions are to only fail on missed meaning. And I think he's saying that when he's going through the deck, he's getting the meaning fine, but the reading he's having a lot of trouble with.
Oh, okay. I guess I was assuming that we were kind of talking about like someone in the middle of stage 2 or something. I guess I probably should have
No, he said he hasn't started sentence binding yet.
Oh, okay. Then in that case, let me see. I mean, in that case, then, I mean, the what we kind of recommend at Refold is watching things with subtitles, mainly, to be the main way that you're immersing right off the bat. Because yeah, that's the thing with when you very first start sentence mining, or you just finish the JP1K and you jump into immersion, your kanji recognition ability is going to be still just developing, right? It's like an infant that has been born into the world but is still very delicate. So trying to jump right into reading actual text is going to be really difficult at that point. So instead, if you focus on watching with subtitles, then you can continue to grow and strengthen your kanji recognition ability in a way that where you won't really be being penalized for your lack of kanji recognition ability, right? Because you can hear everything being pronounced. So I would recommend focusing on pure listening as well as watching with subtitles, and not really try to read raw text right off the bat. That's something I'd wait until you're a little further down in stage 2 before doing. And then you don't really have the problem anymore.
Cool. So in summary, the first thing that you said really applies to stage 2B and beyond.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, doesn't all the stuff I said doesn't apply at all if you're doing the JP1K.
Cool.
Yeah. Basically, the way I think about it is you're, when you start the JP1K, you're starting off from a position where you're not grading yourself at all based on the reading, right? Because you have no kanji recognition ability yet, so you can't grade yourself on the reading, or you're not gonna be able to move at all. You're gonna be stuck. So you keep going, but you're not grading yourself on the reading, and then over time, your kanji recognition ability gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And as your kanji recognition ability gets stronger, you kind of hold yourself more accountable for your ability to recognize, to recall the readings of specific kanji. So you gotta kind of have to gauge how far you are in the process of developing your kanji recognition ability, and let that be the guide of how strict you're going to be to yourself. If you're just starting off and your kanji recognition ability is just budding, then yeah, you got to cut yourself a ton of slack, and maybe you will end up recalling the meanings in English when you're ending up reading and things like that. But over time, as your kanji recognition ability gets stronger, then you want to look things up more often, just hold yourself to a higher standard until you eventually get to the point where you just expect yourself to be able to read every word that you know without a lot of problems.
Cool. Rebecca White is commenting on the conversation that she has the opposite problem with the JP1K. I grade only on meanings, but I almost always get the reading correct.
Well, that's great. I mean, is that a problem? That doesn't sound like a problem. That just sounds like it's going great for you, but...
Will wishes he had that problem. All right, moving on. So we got one question left in the queue. So again, if you have any, feel free to put them in the chat. Bob is asking, Matt, when learning Japanese, how many times, if any, did you believe that you had finally gotten good only to run into another wall? If that happened, did it motivate you or demotivate you? And what was it like?
I mean, maybe like 3 or 4 times, I guess. I mean, my memory is kind of vague, but I mean, I never thought I had mastered the language, but there were points where I kind of felt like, okay, I've reached a milestone, and I've kind of gotten somewhere where I can be really proud of. And then I got a little further, and then didn't feel that way anymore because I realized how much I didn't know. And I probably, there are probably 3 or 4 big arcs that I went through that. But I wouldn't say that I hit a wall because I was never stuck. I never at any point in time felt, I don't know how to improve. I reached a plateau. I never felt like that. I always felt like, okay, I know exactly where my weak spots are, and I know exactly what I need to do to improve them. So I never felt that I hit a wall, but there were, just times where I would kind of wake up one day and it would just hit me like, there's so much I don't know. In fact, I only know a tiny little bit, and I suck compared to a native speaker. So I pretty much just nowhere close where I want to be, and therefore don't really feel that proud of my ability ultimately. So yeah, when that happened to me, I mean, I think most of the time I just felt more motivated because I knew what I wanted. I wanted to master Japanese. So when I became aware of the fact that I wasn't there yet and I had a lot more to go, that all that meant to me was, okay, well, let's get to work and keep on going. And sometimes it would excite me because I liked jumping into a new domain that I wasn't comfortable and trying to figure it out and learning lots of new words and getting that feeling of that I'm making tangible growth. That was really fun and exciting for me. So I think most of the time it was really exciting. There were probably specific moments where I got pretty down because it just felt like, oh, I have so far to go. I've been doing this so long, yet I'm still just so far from where I'd want to be. But for the most part, I mean, I always enjoyed the whole process. So I think, those specific moments of realizing how much I still sucked never really affected me in a negative way.
Cool. I feel like I've gotten good with a TV show that I've been immersing with for a while, and I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then I jump into a new domain or a new TV show or a new dialect, and I'm just like, crap, I don't know anything. All right. Well, that's the last question. If anybody has last minute questions, we can definitely answer them now. We'll wait a few minutes, but otherwise, I think we can call this one done. So wait a few minutes. If you want to hang out with us for a few minutes, then hang out. Feel free to talk. And then we'll drop off in, say, 5 minutes. Otherwise, we can just call this one done. If there's no more questions.
Sorry. Choking on water.
So with my last comment, So the thing with the JP1K deck was that, like, yeah, I get the readings right, but for some reason the meanings just will not stick. I fail pretty easy, but like the meanings, like my brain just doesn't want to associate the English, so I try to just go with mental images, I guess.
And how successful have you been with recalling the mental images?
For some of the words, I feel like that's been a little better. Like, what was it, like maybe kakeru, like to hang something up. I just imagine someone putting like a coat on a coat rack.
Yeah, well, I mean, from my perspective, if you can see the word and recall an image related to the meaning, that's just as good as recalling an English definition. I mean, ultimately, our goal is not to recall English definitions; it's just to understand the word. So, there's no. In fact, there's a pretty good argument to be made for the mental image being better or superior to the English definition. Where I was kind of talking about that for the question on how to think more in mentalese. So go with that if you feel like the mental images are working well for you.
Yeah, I prefer the mental images over the. I like either mental images or being able to explain it in my target language, or like relate it to another synonym in the target language. Try to get away from English.
By the way, and my kakeru is one of the persistent puzzles that I talked about in the cheat sheet that you can get by signing up for the cheat sheet in the description of my persistent puzzles video. And I think I came up with a pretty good explanation of what it means. It's basically just the motion of like putting something onto something else. And so, yeah, that can mean hanging up because you're putting a coat like onto a coat rack or something. But it can also mean put on your glasses, like putting your glasses on top of your nose. Or what are some of the other ones? Like they use it to use a vacuum because you're putting your vacuum onto the floor. Or to sit down because you're putting your hips onto a chair, right? So it means to sit down. And then the ones that are maybe less intuitive are, it can also mean to spend time or money. So the money one, actually, if you think of it as, it basically means you're putting money down on top of a table to say like, here you go, $5. Sorry if that was really loud. I was banging my microphone, but you're saying, yeah, here's $5, and then that, so that means to spend money. It's like you're metaphorically putting money down onto a table. And then same thing with time. You can think of as you're spending time as if it was a physical object that you could slap down onto a table and say, here you go, 5 hours. I'll purchase this skill, or I'll purchase this task being done to the god of time. So if you think of it that way, then almost every meaning of kakeru boils down to this motion of putting one thing on top of another thing.
Funny, in Spanish, there's poner, which is to put, but it's also to put on, and it has like all of these other meanings, like, you know, turning red because you're embarrassed. Like,
so with like more abstract words, say like, I don't know if it's a good example, but like hazu. So like, my brain wants to put like an abstract feeling to it rather than hold on to a meaning. Is that also kind of on the more of the good end of it all?
I mean, the tricky thing is the abstract kind of feeling that you might associate with it might not actually be accurate, right? Because to really get what hazu actually means, you have to see it tons of times and understand it in countless different sentences. So if you just kind of make one up or just go with something that hits you when you first come across the word, there's a good chance that it's not going to be in line with the actual meaning. So I think as long as you hold it lightly, then you should be fine. Just be aware of that potential trap. Like, don't solidify it too much. But ultimately, I mean, everything you're doing in Anki is, from a certain perspective, is creating mental bookmarks or mental dictionary entries. You just want to help yourself get to the point that when you come across in your immersion, you recognize, oh, it's that one. And every time you see it, you recognize that it's the same one. Because if you see something, 3 days in a row, but each time you saw it, you thought it was a different word, then you didn't really learn anything. You have to, if you see something once a day for 3 days in a row and you realize it's that same one each time, well, now you have 3 different data points you can connect together, start to paint a bigger picture. So your goal with Anki is to kind of build this mental dictionary entry so that every time you see it, you can associate that particular context. You can kind of hook it on to that space or that drawer you built in your brain for that particular word. And so if coming up with some kind of feeling that you associate with the word helps you do that, helps you just create a kind of drawer in the dresser of Japanese in your brain so that every time you come across it, you have somewhere to put that context. And over time, you let go of your initial impression and let it kind of morph into what it really means, then I think that will be perfectly fine. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I generally do like a vague general feeling, so sounds good. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. 2 new questions. Will would like a summary of what mentalese is.
So I have a video on it called what was that actually called?
How to not think in your target language.
I was going to say some provocative title. That's all I remember. How to not think in your target language. But by the way, I if I could go back, I would make that video pretty different than it is now. Just because I was like too provocative meaninglessly, and a bunch of people like I took it way too literally, and there's a bunch of angry comments of people that didn't really get what I was trying to say. But the core concept still holds, which is basically that, what mentalese is, it's just how, we have Chinese, Japanese, mental ease. So it's supposed to be the language of pure thought or pure concepts that is at the root of our cognition. So a lot of people who are monolingual kind of assume that we think, like, for example, let's say you're a monolingual English speaker. A lot of people who are monolingual English speakers think that they actually think in English and that their thoughts are synonymous with the English language. Like, they can't have a thought unless the thought is actually in the English language. But this isn't the case. There's actually a kind of pure, a substrate of pure conceptual just isness that is the root of how we think, and it's kind of like intertwined or layered on, or English is kind of layered on top of that. So I give a bunch of different arguments. I come at it from different angles in this video to try to make people have the realization of like, oh yeah, of course I don't think in English. Or I don't think in a language. Of course, sometimes we think in a language, right? Sometimes we have an internal monologue. I'm not saying no one has an internal monologue. That would obviously be absurd. But I'm saying we don't always have an internal monologue. There's a portion to thought that is beyond language, that is more direct. And sometimes, and that's always there. Just sometimes we have English that comes along with it as well. And I think people who, like, at a certain point when you're learning a second language, you kind of spontaneously have this realization, because, like, I remember the first time I had this realization was when I was in Japan trying to speak Japanese with my host brother, and there was something I wanted to say, and I didn't know how to say it in Japanese, but it also wasn't English. It was just a thought that I had. I was just like, how do I say this? And I just felt it. It was just a clear, like, it was just like I had a meaning, just a pure meaning that I was experiencing, and it wasn't English and it wasn't Japanese, and I didn't know how to put it into Japanese. So that was when I realized, oh, I don't think in English, I think in just pure meaning. And once I had that realization, it became really obvious that, of course, how could we think in meaning? Or sorry, how could we think in language? You can't put something into language unless you already have a thought that you want to express in the first place. But until you actually have that experiential aha moment, it can seem like it can just not make sense. So at a certain point, it'll happen to all of us. You don't have to, if it doesn't make sense yet, don't worry about it. It'll definitely happen to you one day. But yeah, that I think priming people, planting that seed that you don't think in language can help people have the realization more quickly than they would otherwise.
Cool. All right, one last question out of the chat. Tee-hee, tummy tums. Makes me laugh every time. You have previously expressed the idea that reading is inherently easier than listening. Do you think it's worth it to spend significantly more time and effort on listening ability in order to keep listening and reading on the same level? There are words that I can recognize just through seeing the character, and others that I can recognize just through hearing them spoken. Is it a good idea to make/convert Anki cards to train the other ability for those words?
I mean, it depends on what your goals are, because if, for example, your final goal is to get to around a B2 level in a language and you want to do it as quickly as possible, well then there's no real good reason to, heavily focus on listening more than reading, because that might delay the whole process, right? Because reading is inherently easier, by focusing heavily on reading, you can get to the same level in a quicker period of time, although you will have those negative side effects that I was talking about before. But if you're like, I want to get to the highest possible level possible in my target language, and I don't really care if it takes me an extra couple years to get there, then I do think that it would be worth doing that. And so for me in Japanese, if I could go back, I would have spent less time reading for the first couple years, and I would have spent significantly more time listening, so that I could have ended up less reading dominant today. So if I could go back, that's probably the biggest piece of advice I'd give to my past self about learning Japanese, if I had the opportunity to do that. But ultimately, it is going to make it take longer, and it's probably going to make it harder for most people. So you really have to weigh the pros and cons and see what makes sense for your goals.
Yeah, the guide as it's currently written focuses on reading first with subtitles before sort of like actualizing that into pure listening later on. So,
but the other point I should say that I was going to say I forgot is that watching with subtitles, I think it does not come with the negative side effect, as many negative side effects as pure reading. There's probably some of them, but because you're hearing it said the entire time, even if it's in the background and you're not paying as much attention, I still think that kind of so I can't remember the word, but it kind of allows you to avoid picking up some of the potential negative side effects that would come if you were just doing reading, like true raw reading.
And then the last part of this question was, is it a good idea to make Anki cards for the opposite of those words?
I probably wouldn't, just because it's going to be easy to fill in those gaps just through immersion, right? Like for the words that you can, like for example, if there's words that you can hear but you can't read, well, if you just watch with target language subtitles, you're going to like automatically fill in those gaps, because you're going to hear the word, understand it, and you're going to see how it's written. And then the same thing can happen. Actually, it can happen both ways. Then there'll be other times where you see the word, you recognize it, and then you hear how it's pronounced. So I think it's pretty easy to, like, if you know one, filling in the other is pretty easy just through immersion. So I would save your cards for learning new words and just rely on immersion for filling up all those little gaps.
Cool. Thanks for the question. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for all the questions you submitted. This is great. This is actually a really solid live stream. So thanks for joining us. And we'll be back on in another 4 weeks to answer more questions. So we hope to see you all there.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.